Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the second of BDO's webinar series for 2024, which is focused on the question of where is the H for human in ESG. And during this session, we're going to look at how human capital and people drivers are integral to the successful delivery of any charity or non-profit's ESG agenda. So my name's Fiona Condren, and I head up BDO's work in the charity sector across both external audit and actually a growing and increasing range of advisory services as well. I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined by two of BDO's experts in this field to share different aspects of human capital. To start with, we have Zsolt Zelensky, who's a partner and BDO's national lead for people advisory solutions, and Zsolt will be followed by Caroline Jones, a director specialising in employment tax compliance and solutions. Just so that you're aware, the session is being recorded and will be shared with you over the next couple of days. So if you've missed anything or want to share the content with colleagues, there'll be a chance for you to catch up. The slides will also be available to download, which will help in situations where there's lots of detail on those slides and the presenters won't necessarily have time to cover off everything while they're speaking. Just a little bit of extra housekeeping. At the end of each of the two sessions, there will be an opportunity for the speaker to answer a few questions. So as I said at the beginning, please do put them in the Q&A function below, either a direct question or a more general question around how to take forward these areas. And if we don't have time to answer all the questions today, then we will endeavour to respond to them after the event. The session is designed to finish at 10 o'clock. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to my first speaker, Zsolt.
Thank you very much, Fiona, and good morning to everyone. Before I explain you the agenda and manage your expectations on the first part of the webinar, let me start with a story which makes the case for the strange title for the webinar today, Where is the Age in ESG? So it's a sport analogy. So if you go back to the 80s, when a famous basketball player, NBA player, Michael Jordan, is said to have a very notorious discussion with his coach. The coach thought Michael was a bit egoistic and selfish in one of the games. And he challenged Michael saying, look, Michael, if you spell the word team, there is no I in that. And Michael allegedly responded that, yes, boss, I take your point. But if you spell win, there is an I in that. So taking that analogy to ESG, you might say, well, if you spell ESG, there is no age for human. But if you wanted to make it happen, I think there is an age, and this is what we are trying to cover today. How exactly? So basically, I just wanted to introduce the concept of human and social capital, making sure that we see the difference and we see on a big picture what are the four connecting points to ESG, which we might want to explore. Then we spend a little more time about what's the detail, what is that actually you can do in terms of these four elements. Then we look at a little bit how it relates to most typical ESG metrics and how we can put it into a sort of integrated framework with metrics and actions. A little outlook in regulatory environment, making sure that we see what are the kind of guiding regulatory pieces that helps us to connect the dots. I'd really like to spend proper time in sector specifics. What makes it specific to not-for-profit sector, whatever spectrum you are. And then we'd like to leave time for conclusions, feedback. I would really like to encourage you to ask questions or try to take away one idea that you can put in practice in your environment. So without much further ado, let's look at the next slide, if I can. So basically what you can see in the middle is the typical interpretation of ESG with environmental and social and the governance components. And I don't think that contains anything new. It just gives you a little bit of a detail about what are the typical definitions within ESG community when it comes to the three elements. So let me start with the top of the screen. So you might say environmental is not very human, isn't it? But if it's change related, and as it says, well, actually climate change, any sort of change has a very deep human element. If you just think about, selective waste management, you need to change your daily habits, how you actually classify your household garbage, etc. So that has a behavioral change element. And if you think bigger in any sort of environmental consciousness, it at the end of the day, it goes down to changing behaviors, which is a very human element. So organizational and change management, how we can facilitate people level changes, I think plays in a big way. Now, the key thing that I wanted to introduce is the differentiation between human capital and social capital. Typically, these two are washed together, and I think there is a good way to, there's a useful thing to keep them separate, because it helps us to understand how we might want to connect it to ESG. Human capital is typically about the skills, individual capabilities. It is the skill-related assets that we bring to a table, whereas social capital is how we connect to each other, what we collectively bring to the table. So it's more about networks, it's more about the way we connect, good or bad. So all together, with that sort of notions, let me just say that on one hand, when you talk about skills and capabilities, typically things like leadership skills, or even more technical skills on risk management or tax, etc., that relates very clearly to the human capital of the equation. So developing skills in these particular subsets, as you can see here, anti-corruption, risk management, tax, and leadership are very clear human capability developments, which we can actually accelerate the ESG implementation, again, making it happen. But I think probably the one which is most ignored, and we have probably the most room for development, is the social capital. It is harder to define, but things that we can do collectively, probably the one thing that I would single out is the community management. Think about, for instance, diversity inclusion. There is no such a thing like diversity inclusion without the social context, without the networking. It is all about how you engage with other people. Yes, there might be some skills and capabilities, how you can do it better, but in fact, this is more like a social thing, and you can only do it together. And I think that's true for some of the other elements about, product and consumer responsibility, health and safety, and all the others. So that's the social capital element of the equation. And then there is a bit of an overlap. If you look particularly business ethics and labor standards and human rights, etc., that relates and anchors very deeply in the notion of culture. So managing organizational culture is something that, well, we define culture as the way things get done in certain organizations. And that is actually a great multiplicator. If you have the right culture, and if you can create a culture which supports your ESG initiatives, particularly about ethics and human rights, etc., that is, again, a great way. So in summary, the four major things: change management, culture, capability development, which is human capital, and network development, which is the social capital. So these are the four factors that we would look at when looking at these synergies. Next slide, please. All right, so if you'd like a little more detail about, okay, well, directionally that's fine, but what is it exactly that you can do? That gives you a little bit of a menu. I'm not going to cover all the bullet points, but let me just say what are the typical interventions or the typical actions that you can do, particularly in terms of human capital and social capital. This time, I disregard a little bit change management and culture. We could go into that, but let me focus on the two elements. So when it comes to human capital components, sustainable leadership, you see a couple of good practices, how you can specifically target your leadership capabilities, whether this is the top team or more broadly leadership capability throughout the organization. Again, anti-corruption and business ethics. Here you can see a couple of bullet points where you can improve your capabilities, skills. Again, tax, particularly how you promote transparency and data management about tax. So you see here psychological safety, for instance, etc. And then the people risk management, which is kind of a new discipline, is combining risk management function with deep understanding of people matters and trying to anticipate risks rather than handling them or managing consequences of negative events. So trying to really be more proactive. And on the social capital part, health and safety, as you see, and that's nothing new. A couple of bullet points about what you can do in terms of product and consumer responsibility. Community impact would be probably my pick, which is mostly disregarded. How you interact, what are the communities that matters to you, both internally and externally, how you define them, how you manage them, how you actually make the interactions more under control. So I would really like to emphasize on this community management, which is a new growing discipline. Diversity inclusion is obviously there, and I'm pretty sure you have already initiatives there which you can connect to ESG. But most, in my experience working with clients, probably more often it does not happen. So they have distinct diversity and inclusion initiatives and ESG. Very often these are integrated in a way that can make more impact. And last but not least, labor and human rights. Again, a couple of specific points. Let me just encourage you, if you'd like to explore anything out of these smaller bullet points more in detail, please ask a question or make a comment on that in the comment section. I can't cover all the bullet points here, but I just wanted to give you a kind of a high level art of possible insights. Let me stop here a little bit, let you digest this, ask your question, make your comments if you have one, and then we move on to the next slide. All right, this is pretty much like how it all fits together. This is BDO ESG framework, and I would like to point out a couple of things. First of all, we already have standard metrics defined on human capital and social capital. It is SASB or ISSB disclosure. So these are the ones, the typical ones that organizations do measure, or they are asked to measure if they look after their ESG initiatives. But the right-hand side are, we highlighted 7 areas where we think we can pretty much relate the people initiatives to the ESG metrics. And again, it's partly overlapping with the art of possible, the broader menu which you have seen before. But our 3 picks which we think are most impactful is, again, sustainable leadership, promoting the culture of ethics, introducing a more specific people risk function that would be more on the human capital part. And when it comes to the social capital, linking better diversity and inclusion initiatives with ESG, community management, promoting more the belonging, the feeling of belonging, etc., these tribes, etc. And then last but not least, sustainable talent and workforce practices. And in the middle, you can see this people due diligence, which happens pretty much in a merger and acquisition situation, which is a bit of a mix of all the other 6 factors. So I'm not going to specifically deal with that, but should you be in a merger and acquisition situation, this is probably a good way to start linking ESG and people matters. There is one more point that I would like to make here on this slide. Typically, ESG initiatives focus on the first 3 columns here, collecting data, disclosure, and targeted communication. In BDO's approach, we'd like to suggest taking 2 steps further. So once you need to do the disclosure and communication anyhow, if you make a little more effort, probably you can actually kill more birds with the same stone. So we are not asking you to do anything new. We are saying whatever you do, if you can actually add the 2 other steps, reviewing your policies and processes in terms of what are the actions that you can implement and monitor them. And pretty much the last point is the culture and network development and change management, all the human elements that I added, which is beyond the policies. These are 2 focuses where you can extend your focus, but extend it in a way that brings you results. Next slide, please. I just wanted to quickly, it's a short slide, and I appreciate you might not be able to read the small text, but basically I just wanted to highlight the 6 major regulatory anchor points, which I'm pretty sure you're all aware. But in the light of this differentiation between social capital, which is SC, and human capital, which is HC, actually it's quite balanced. You can see 3 pieces of legislation, which is more human capital, and 3 pieces, which is more about social capital. Make sure that if you wanted to engage with particularly human or social capital, you might want to get some inspiration about what's the regulatory expectation on that. I think, again, if you have any questions about these particular pieces of regulatory, I'm happy to pick up later on or follow up on that. Next slide, please. Again, this is something that I really like to spend some time on. And if we can, well, let me go through on the 6 elements which in our experience makes special importance in the not-for-profit section. First of all, the funding and financial sustainability. Typically, if you are getting your funding in kind of ESG specific funding mechanisms, then I think it's a very elementary question that you need to put more emphasis and actually maybe even a differentiating factor in the way you connect your ESG practices to human practices. So what I'm saying with that, you can secure more stable financing if you are accelerating your involvement in ESG. Second thing is obviously about the climate change and resource management. So basically, as you can see, many of the non-profit sectors, I'm not sure about your practices, but many of them are particularly sensitive. Sometimes they are focused on climate change, resource management. So it is part of the kind of vision of the organizations, not infrequently, that you need to discuss. Stakeholder engagement and social impact. Again, it is more like various stakeholders. So community management particularly is more important, I think, for not-for-profit organizations, because that's the lifeblood, that's the context most of the not-for-profit organizations operate. Governance and transparency. Again, this is about reputation. So if you run a successful not-for-profit organization, probably one of the secret of your success would be the reputation, and this is often achieved by good governance and transparency. So there's good reason to concentrate on that. Again, social inequalities and diversity. Many not-for-profit organizations have that embedded in their vision. So again, you can't afford not to pay special attention to that. And regulatory compliance, I think it relates a little bit to governance and transparency, but generally speaking, if you have a strong regulatory component in your work, probably it's a good way. And I would revisit the previous slide. Specifically, some of the regulatory components really drive particular attention for ESG in not-for-profit. So I would really like to ask you to maybe reflect on these. If there is anything which is missing, I would really like to hear in the questions, or if you feel very strongly about what makes ESG specifically a strong case in your particular environment, I would love to learn about that, or have a discussion whether these 6 factors resonate with you or any of those in particular. Next slide, please. All right. So in the next 2 slides, I wanted to give you a little bit of almost like restaurant menu. So obviously, I don't want to go into details about all these bullet points, but that's, again, digging a little bit deeper about these 6 or actually 7 key areas that BDO has identified as a potential way to connect ESG with human practices. So again, this is nothing new. So you'll see the 6 boxes that I highlighted before, but with a little bit of a more context. What is it that you actually do? And what I suggest you might do as you read these slides, meanwhile I speak, you might cherry pick certain ideas that you think, hey, that's interesting. We have not explored that to the full extent. We'd like to understand what it is more. So again, read that as a restaurant menu. I'm not suggesting that you eat all the menu items here, but if you can find what seems to be appealing or are a good fit for your practices, that's the way I would suggest to read that. So sustainable leadership, again, as you can see, it is related to the governance structure, but it goes beyond that. It's how you actually operate the governance structure that you have. Ethical culture, this is one subset of our overall culture work. So being ethical is only one aspect of your culture journey, but I would suggest focusing on rather certain elements of the culture than trying to control it all. And being ethical is probably a good thing to connect ESG. People risk management, I already talked about. There are certain ways you can make it happen. And if I can have the next slide, please, which is probably my last slide, I hope. So diversity and inclusion, again, my comment on that would be you probably have ongoing initiatives. So I'm not suggesting to find anything new. I'm suggesting to connect better existing initiatives to ESG. And that's probably the business case also, that we are not suggesting necessarily to start doing anything new. What we are suggesting is to link better what actually can belong together. Sustainable talent and workforce, that's a broad church. You see there are a lot of ways to skin a cat here. So if you think any of these bullet points would make sense, I encourage you to explore that a little bit more. And the last bit is community management belonging, which is my personal favorite. I think that's the point where there's a little more room for acceleration. Most organizations have talent and diversity initiatives. Very few organizations have very seriously thought through community management practices. I actually think that concludes my presentation.
Thanks, Zsolt. There was just a couple of questions that came up during your session. The first one is, could you just explain more about what you mean by psychological safety in tax?
Yeah, psychological safety, generally speaking, and I don't think it's that much different in tax, is that you can challenge the status quo, ask questions without the fear of being any repercussion or any negative consequences. So basically, particularly when it comes to tax, I think that means pretty much the same. Are you safe to ask questions? Are you safe to sort of challenge status quo? If you are not sure that you are doing the right thing, can you raise that without any fear or frustration? So that's, and I think psychological safety is a great dynamic area of people management, which connects very well in general. So it's not just tax, but I put that up in tax because I think it can have a specific relevance there.
Okay, thank you. And another question, which is quite a big question, so just need to be a bit careful with time, but how can charities effectively align their human capital strategies with their ESG goals to ensure that both sets of objectives support and reinforce each other? And what are some of the practical steps for achieving this alignment in the context of some limited resources that charities might have?
Yeah, but on that note, well, this is the whole webinar is all about. There is not one way to do that right. Perhaps the one thing that I would single out is that you don't try to do and spread too thinly. As you say, you probably have limited resources. That's why it's better to cherry pick one or two specific things that you think makes the difference. And this is my analogy back to the restaurant menu. Don't try to have a very broad feast of the art of possible. Try to cherry pick the one or two or three things that you think you can excel, and then you can take another one. So focus would be my one word recommendation. Take focus at an early stage if you can.
Great. Thank you. Well, just to reiterate, there is time to put further questions in the chat. Zsolt can pick them up at the end of the session. But at this point, I'm going to thank you, Zsolt, and I'm going to pass over to Caroline.
Okay, thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Zsolt. So you've heard from Zsolt about the human element of ESG and a bit about climate change. And I'm going to try and give you some ideas in relation to reward for employees, which feed into that green agenda. So let's have a look at the sorts of areas we're going to cover. Jamie, if we could just move on, please. Okay, so the areas that I'm going to cover as part of this morning is going to be around embedding ESG and what that might mean from a reward perspective. the types of staff benefits that maybe you could offer. I'm going to look at electric vehicles in particular and a little bit of a case study around that, some other green opportunities, and then how we might be able to help you. So if we can just go on to the next slide, please, Jamie. So I think what I've found in my role as a trustee of a charity is, you know, what's our driver for change? What do we want to do? Is it about retaining talent, attracting new talent? And have we got the right reward package for our employees? So we've got, you know, is it a flexible package or is it old-fashioned? So there are some really standard benefits that we see quite often offered to employees, but actually I think it's about making your package more flexible and affordable, and I'll come on to the affordable bit after, because I know that's really key for charities. And we've heard a lot about attracting talent and retaining it, and I think how are you going to address that? So is there something that you can do that is not necessarily going to increase the costs for your particular organisation, but would make it more attractive for people, where sometimes pay is not the sole driver for them? So it's not just about green benefit offerings. I'm going to cover a few other things that I'm seeing not-for-profit organisations introducing, and indeed the sort of wider employer population as well. And I think we all need to be more flexible in our thinking as the working environment changes. So I think that, you know, if we look at 10 years ago, the sort of benefits that were offered then are very different to the sorts of things that you can offer now. So I'm going to go through a few of those potential opportunities, and then we'll think about, you know, quick wins and ones that are a little bit more difficult as well. So you've got that whole sort of suite to think about. So if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to talk specifically about agile working, because this is something that we've seen a lot of since COVID, and it has actually been embedded in a lot of organisations, and it is seen as very attractive to today's workforce. So I think when people are advertising jobs these days, that is one of the first things that a lot of candidates look at, is whether or not you've actually got that flexible approach to working from home. And, you know, how would that help your green agenda? So does it cut down on your costs? Because, you know, it shouldn't add any cost to your organisation beyond supplying office equipment. So you may choose to do that, you may not. But you could also choose to make payments to your employees who have a home working arrangement. So you can pay £6 a week to help them with the extra costs they may have, sort of lighting and heating and things like that. And that isn't taxable. So obviously that's increasing your cost base if you choose to do that. But that is something that you can offer to employees, and it doesn't have an impact from an HMRC perspective. I think where I see this sometimes going wrong is that if you haven't got a clear policy about agile working, and if your contracts don't reflect what happens in practice, you can sometimes fall down with HMRC, and I'll explain why that might be now. So if your contracts still say that your place of work is an office or a particular site, then if people are working from home, HMRC may take the view that it's not under a home working arrangement. And it's important that you have got that in the contracts, because if HMRC ever carry out any sort of employer compliance review with you, they always start off with contractual arrangements, and that's whether they're looking at things like travel and subsistence, or even if they're looking at more sort of wider approaches to, you know, how people are working and what benefits they're entitled to. They start with a contract and then they look at what's happening in practice. So getting your contracts right is really, really important. But I think what I'm seeing is that cutting down on commuting time is really, really attractive to today's workforce. They want to be able to have that more time. And actually, a lot of people are more productive at home as long as you've got the right things in place for them to work for you. I appreciate that's not possible for all organisations. And for example, if you've got shops and things like that, people do need to be on site. But it is something that you could think about. I think the risk around people working from home is that HMRC are really keen that if they are working under a home working arrangement, that you don't reimburse any costs to them travelling to their normal workplace. And their normal workplace from an HMRC perspective is if they visit somewhere regularly, or if prior to COVID they were office-based. So HMRC do get a little bit excited about that. So you need to make sure that your procedures and policies are clear and people know what this means to them. So I think, you know, agile working is an easy one if you get your contractual arrangements right. Shouldn't cost you anything extra unless you decide to make that £6 a week payment, or you provide office equipment. But the office equipment clearly is a one-off for your staff. So that's something that you can think about, and that will be quite an easy quick win, and you wouldn't really have to worry about anything to do with getting clearance or anything like that from HMRC. Okay, so let's go on and see, next slide please. So we're going to talk about electric vehicles. So we've heard a lot recently about green cars, electric vehicles. Lots and lots of employers are offering this. It's particularly been popular in the NHS and higher education. It's something that's seen by many as an attractive option because electric cars are so expensive for people to source themselves. This is something that employers are thinking about from a value perspective, and also it feeds into the green agenda. So is it something that you would offer as an option for your employees? It is very important that you get the right supplier. And in order to make sure that you meet all the requirements of having electric vehicles, because lots of people say to me they don't want to manage an electric fleet. If you get the right supplier, you don't actually end up having to manage that fleet. The supplier will give you the information in relation to forms P11D, because of course, as you're providing the car, that will be a responsibility for you as the employer. But also we get lots of questions around things like early termination. So what if somebody leaves? You know, what happens then? And there's all sorts of insurance policies that suppliers can offer you to make sure that that's covered. The other really, really important thing is national minimum wage. So if you're offering this as an option to your employees via salary sacrifice, you need to be absolutely certain that that salary sacrifice, when taken into account, doesn't take individuals below national minimum wage, which unfortunately means that for some of the lower paid employees, it isn't an option. But, you know, you can do some modelling at the outset to make sure that those people that you're offering this to won't have a problem with the national minimum wage side of things. You may already have an existing car fleet and you may own that, or you may lease it. Could you convert that to electric vehicles? So I'm going to talk about a case study in a moment where I've seen a client do that and convert mainly to electric vehicles. And if you don't want to consider offering the vehicles themselves to employees, can you install chargers at work? So a lot of employers across the UK are doing that now, that they will put chargers at work, and for some of them, they won't charge their employees for charging their electric vehicles. For others, they do have a small charge. So it's not just about the vehicles themselves. As people are converting more towards electric vehicles, then you could potentially do something around the chargers. They're really attractive in terms of the benefit in kind, because at the moment, the benefit is based on 2% of the list price of the vehicle, which is considerably less than other petrol or diesel vehicles, which are the benefit is based on the CO2. So it could be anything up to 35% of the list price. So as you can see, it's really, really attractive to have that lower emissions vehicle or no emission vehicle. Okay, next slide, please, Jamie. So I mentioned that an organisation I've worked with had already done something around their fleet. So they had a large fleet of vehicles, it was plus 200, and they were used by employees for both business and private purposes. So that meant that that particular organisation had to submit forms P11D each year based on the CO2 emissions, some of which were quite high. The employees were paying a significant amount of tax on the benefit in kind, and the employer pays 13.8% Class 1A NIC on the benefit. So you can see immediately that switching from petrol to electric brings that Class 1A charge for employers right down. In this particular case, the employer decided that they were going to dispose of the fleet of owned vehicles, so they owned them all, and they were going to replace them with a fleet of leased cars, many of which were electric or hybrid. So they did some modelling at the outset, and they decided that it was going to give them some significant savings. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So what they decided to do was they switched their, say, essential user fleet, so the people who needed to use the cars for business, to electric. And they also offered to employees who weren't currently in a company salary sacrifice scheme if they would like to join. And as part of that arrangement, they offered to install home chargers. So I think what's really important here is that if you decide to install a charger at home, you can include it as part of the salary sacrifice arrangement, and it doesn't give rise to any additional tax. Because of the way that the car benefit rules work, you only get charged on the list price of the vehicle when you've got an electric vehicle. So you can do these home chargers and there's no additional benefit in kind. The most important thing, I think, to organisations, particularly not-for-profit, is to make sure that it isn't creating any additional cost for you. So you do this on a cost-neutral basis. You model a salary sacrifice arrangement so that the individual is saving their tax and national insurance. Some of you may be familiar with something called the OPRA rules, which means that if you've got a higher emission car, you have to compare, if you've got a cash allowance, you compare the cash allowance with the benefit in kind, and the benefit is the highest of those two, and that's what needs to go on the P11D. You don't need to make any comparison if you've got electric vehicles or low emission vehicles. So it's very straightforward in terms of the benefit in kind, and you can model it to make sure that the individuals get savings, you could get savings, or that it's cost neutral to your organisation. So it's possible to do that quite easily. And it means that the fleet is more efficient. If you're offering electric vehicles to employees who may be using their vehicles for business occasionally, you're getting rid of that grey fleet, which sometimes causes some alarm through health and safety issues because they might be older, higher emissions. You've got to think about MOTs and things like that. And it reduces the cost of maintaining the fleet, and the fuel costs less. Really important thing is that you get the right supplier here. Okay, next slide, please. So as I said, you can charge at home or work. So because it's not classed as a fuel, for EVs where you put the chargers at home, no benefit in kind, there's an exemption for you putting it in work. So if they're allowed to charge at work free of charge, and you're not introducing any sort of charge for them at work, then there's no benefit in kind there either. So where the employee pays for the electric personally, then you can pay a flat rate. Actually, that's gone up to 5 pence per mile for business mileage. So in the same way as you may pay people for using their own cars, if they've got petrol or diesel, you'll know that there are approved rates. Well, there are also rates for electric vehicles. As I say, that has gone up. So it's a little bit better. So you can look at the fleet as a whole, or you can do that, you know, just offering to people who are currently using vehicles, or widen it. It's not a quick win, it is something that you need to take some time over, but that is an option for you. So let's have a look at some other benefits then. Jamie, if we could go on, please. Okay. So at the start, I talked about, you know, you could create a whole package of additional benefits, and they could meet the green agenda for employees, or you might choose initially to do some easy wins. So I think creating a package must create some flexibility, but it speaks to what different employees value as well. So I have seen a lot of employers undertaking some focus groups, or maybe some questionnaires about what employees would find attractive. But these are a few things that we're seeing being introduced. So the cycle to work has been embedded for a really long time. It's been available to employers. There are some sort of slight trip ups with the cycle to work scheme. It is an easy one and it is a quick one to introduce, but you do need to make sure that you make that you make that work from an HMRC perspective. So it does have to be open to everybody. And if you can't open it to particular groups of employees for, say, national minimum wage purposes, there are workarounds so that, you know, you can make it work. But it is something that can be introduced quite quickly. Home energy assessments. This is quite innovative, and we're seeing this in a few of our clients already, where they've been really interested to make sure that their employees' homes are energy efficient. Particularly housing associations. Housing associations are very keen to become carbon neutral and to meet the green agenda. So they're thinking about their employees now. Is this something that they would be interested in? And if so, they're introducing that via a salary sacrifice arrangement. It's cost neutral to the employer, because although this would still need to go on a P11D, it attracts Class 1A national insurance, which is the same as Class 1. So you pay the same amount of national insurance, but you're not meeting the costs because the individuals are sacrificing some salary. So that would be cost neutral to you. And it's a really innovative way, actually, of looking at what employees might want. Then we see staff discounts quite a lot, with either with local suppliers or ethical suppliers. So that's something that may be offered as part of a wider package. And as long as it doesn't cost you, the employer, anything, and often it doesn't, because you've got buying power. You know, if you've got a largish workforce, you'd have that buying power. So you could negotiate a discount with a local supplier and it wouldn't cost you anything. As long as there's no cost to you, there's no benefit in kind, so there's no tax consequences of doing that either. So that's something that we're seeing employers looking at, and some employers are introducing. Additionally, we're seeing wellbeing support, and we're seeing more and more employers providing this. And it can be as simple as some organisations provide perhaps free breakfasts once a week to their employees, and because of the way that the canteen exemption works, as long as it's open to everybody, there's no cost attached to the, you know, any benefit in kind arising. So something around that. Or it could be more complicated. So it could be something like an employee assistance programme. So the employee assistance programs are really popular at the moment, and it's just making sure that the different elements that you're including in that don't attract any sort of tax. So HMRC have been a bit broader in their exemption around employee assistance programs, which they call welfare assistance. So looking at the elements that you can offer tax-free in that sort of arrangement is really attractive to some employees. And then the other thing that we're seeing from today's generation find learning and development incredibly attractive. Again, it can be cost neutral if it's introduced via a salary sacrifice arrangement. So creating something with flexibility, but speaking to what employees value, has become really, really important. There are lots of other benefits that you could think about, but I think with these particular ones listed here, we've got some really quick wins. So the cycle to work, home energy assessments, staff discounts, they're all quick wins, and possibly the wellbeing support as well. And just introducing that learning and development, it might be something, say, work-related training. So it could be something that will help them in their role in the future, or maybe in future roles. So that is something that we're seeing in terms of this whole package, and something that you might want to consider. And as I say, there's generally not tax consequences as long as you make sure that you introduce these properly. So at one time, HMRC would give approval for any salary sacrifice arrangements. You as an employer would have to make the application, and HMRC would come back and tell you whether or not they think that the way that you're introducing salary sacrifice for your particular organisation works. I would just caveat that, because I have seen a couple of suppliers of particular benefits saying that they've got clearance from HMRC. So it's not about getting clearance for a particular scheme. It used to be that an employer could ask, and actually that was really, really important that the employer got clearance. HMRC decided a little while ago that they wouldn't give any clearance in future. So these days it's even more important that everything you do, you make sure that it's compliant with HMRC's rules. So if we go on to the next slide, Jamie, we can just talk about how we might be able to help you. So we help lots of organisations around modelling, so which benefits may be the easy wins. modelling potential savings. So I talked about the salary sacrifice for electric vehicles. There could be savings for you or the employer. Do you want to keep them? Do you want to pass them on to the employee, or do you want to share them? So we can help decide with a lot of that. The salary sacrifice documentation is really, really important. As I say, you can't get clearance from HMRC anymore. So it is important to have that in place, and including frequently asked questions, because people do ask questions about, is this going to affect my state benefits? You know, is it going to affect any sort of other benefits that I might be in receipt of? And then we can help with the consulting. So we can help you with deciding on your benefits provider. That's particularly important, I think, with the electric vehicles, and making sure that any arrangements take into account the tax position, and that that's clearly communicated to employees, because you don't want anything to come back on you later. So making sure that it's set up properly from the outset is really important. And then also just making sure that your documentation is clear and concise, so that if HMRC ask you to see it, then you'll be able to produce that, and they will deem that to be low risk, and they won't need to ask any more questions. So just to conclude, really, there are lots and lots of potential opportunities out there. They can be tailored to what your employees find most attractive. Just make sure that if you're implementing anything, that you are doing it and it's tax compliant. Okay, thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Caroline. Perfect timing as well. Just a couple of quick questions, and then we'll open it up for both Zsolt and Caroline to answer questions. So there's still time to put your thoughts or questions in the Q&A function if you've not had an opportunity to do so already. But Caroline, specifically for you, with so many different choices available, what's your recommendation as the first step that an employer could take, just even to identify which of the benefits might be the most helpful to their staff?
So I think, first of all, asking the staff is a really good way of doing it. Just a quick questionnaire. You can have focus groups if you've got a bigger staff population, but asking what's of interest to them, I think, is a really good way to start. And then thinking about the quick wins. You know, it may be that you don't want to do everything at the same time, but just giving them a flavour of what might work for them and what might be available, I think, is a really good starting point.
Yeah, and when you talk about quick wins, what's the typical time frame between identifying a salary sacrifice product that you might want to share with staff and then actually getting it implemented?
That's a really good question, actually. So I think something like the cycle to work, which has been around for a little while, and some attendees might already have that in place. So I think for that sort of thing, you're probably talking 2 or 3 months. Something like electric vehicles, of course, is a lot longer lead time, because there's lots of lead time around the cars, probably 6 months for those. Things like home assessments, that can be done quite quickly, and discounts can be done quite quickly. So anything, I would say, from 2 months to maybe 6, depending on the benefit that you're looking at.
Yeah, and I assume you don't have to implement things with effect from the beginning of a new tax year. They can come in at any point, is that right?
Absolutely. That's a really good question, actually. So you can implement at any time. And with some salary sacrifice arrangements, you might have things like annual renewal dates, very much in the way that we have here at BDO. So, you know, each year you might be able to revisit. It might be things like, I didn't mention holidays, but, you know, you might want to buy holiday or something like that. Then you can have that renewal. So people have that opportunity. The other thing that sometimes is built into these salary sacrifice arrangements are lifestyle changes. So if something changes about the employee's position, they may have the opportunity to opt in or opt out through the year. Great,
thank you. And from your experience, where are the areas where HMRC tend to see organisations getting it wrong, and therefore start prodding around?
So I'd say there are 2 main ones. So cars. HMRC are always really interested in cars, whether they be via salary sacrifice or not. So I think that can be quite difficult to get right, which is why the supplier is so important. But the other one is the cycle to work. There are some really quite obscure rules around cycle to work scheme, around that availability to everybody. So people might think that we'll offer it to everybody as long as they're not affected by national minimum wage. That means their scheme's not compliant. And there's a bit around if the cycle is transferred to the individual at the end. HMRC are really interested in the value of that cycle at the point that it's transferred. So there's those things that can trip people up, and those 2 things are the ones that I see HMRC showing most interest in.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Caroline. And Zolt, if you're still with us, if you can come back on screen, that would be great.
Absolutely.
So just looking at the chat function as well, there was a couple of really big questions that came in for you. I don't know whether you can tackle them in a succinct way at this stage, but the first one was, how can charities engage their stakeholders, including employees, donors, and the communities they serve, to integrate human capital and ESG? What role does communication play in ensuring that all stakeholders recognise these value these efforts? And how do then charities leverage this to foster a culture of sustainability and social responsibility?
Yeah, well, it's an absolutely legitimate but broad question. So let me just try to single out a couple of things which I think matters. First of all, it's a good idea to start with listening. They do have already priorities, and chances are that they do have initiatives which are somehow relatable or adjacent to ESG. And I think it's always a safe bet to start reinforcing something which is already in place rather than suggesting a new initiative. So and again, engaging with, for instance, employee group, I'm pretty sure there is some sort of an engagement survey or some kind of an employee listening exercise. If you revisit that and try to look it from a ESG perspective, what are the potential connectors? This is the way I would start. In terms of donors and particularly communities, chances are that they are less formal listening, and I would suggest maybe it's a good idea to formalize either a discussion, an ongoing dialogue with donors, or particularly creating online or offline communities from your important communities. So if you can identify who are the social stakeholders, you might want to put some effort into organizing them into almost like an online community, sometimes offsite meetings. I actually think talking to them and understanding their priorities is the first step. And the second is take focus. So again, take one thing which seems to connect, prove your point, prove that you can create value. And once the trust is being built, you can then extend it or add new initiatives. But I wouldn't try to do many things at the same time. And communication is important. Particularly, I would highlight not one-time communication. That's why I advocate the idea of running communities and manage communities, and community management as a discipline of its own right. So learning how to set up communities, manage their expectations. But the aspect I would empathize or emphasize is the regular communication rather than one-off.
Fantastic, thank you. And the second one, which again is quite a big question. So how can NFP organisations utilise their ES and then HG agenda in a meaningful way to translate into the third sector, providing them with support that adds social value to society and the beneficiaries that charities serve?
Okay. Well, again, this is partly overlapping. I read that as a little bit of a stakeholder management, particularly the second part of the question, which is more about how you identify or how you manage your social impact. Social impact is a broad thing. So if you can actually specify what are the relevant communities or relevant indicators or representative ambassadors of the communities that you wanted to serve and engage with them a dialogue. So probably it would be a good idea to pick up a specific sector. But if you say, look, for instance, homelessness is your problem, then try to figure out who are the credible voices of that particular social segment. Or if you are into education, again, try to find out a limited number of credible voices, and then organize them as a kind of structured communication and understand their existing capabilities. So I don't think I come up with a brand new idea. It's the same thing apply to the specific stakeholder groups. And also metrics. I can see a question about metrics. I think it's a great insight, because once you establish even a simple metric, that gives you a reason to go back and monitor your progress. So I emphasized on the regularity of the communication. If you identify in only one or two metrics, and I think actually ESG has some metrics which might serve that purpose as facilitating the discussion, actually it's a good idea to look at on a quarterly basis how certain metrics are going, have a discussion about why they think it shapes the way, what can be done. So metrics is a great, I think, facilitator of an ongoing dialogue. And what are the metrics? I can read a question also. What metrics or indicators are the most effective for capturing the nuanced contribution of human capital and ESG outcomes? Two answers for that. I would start with the predefined ESG metrics, the ones that I've shown you. But I would say perhaps the next step is that these are all output metrics, like a kind of a lag metrics, reflecting on something that you have done in the past. What I would like to suggest adding is a couple of lead metrics, which is more about more predictive metrics, which say what I'm doing today has an impact or a lead impact on the potential outcome, because most of the ESG metrics are lagging metrics and it's not very helpful. So I would suggest linking a lead metric to the one lag metrics that you can and work from that basis. And we have a selection of different potential metrics that you can choose for, but it's very contextual. So unfortunately, I can't give you a very simple answer. The last thing I would mention, conscious of time, that we are working on a self-diagnostic tool, which helps you with a structured thinking about where your own most important leverage point might be. So if you have an interest in sort of co-creating or testing this tool, which is in a beta version, it's not ready yet for a broad release. But if you would like to actually work with us on co-creating that, I would be very happy to engage and give you a sneak preview and a chance to test this tool, which is something that we are working on.
Well, that sounds great, Zoltan. I'm sure you'll get a lot of interest from this audience today, so thank you. Well, as you mentioned, I think we're coming close to time now, so I'm going to draw this session to a close. Thank you, Zoltan and Caroline, for giving up your time and expertise this morning. If you still wanted to pose a question, then do so, and we'll get back to you directly. As I mentioned at the beginning, the session has been recorded and it will be shared with you over the next couple of days. And our next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 12th of June. So please do look out for your invite, which will be coming soon. We haven't yet finalised the topic. So if you have got burning issues or things that you would like us to cover, then please do let us know. And finally, we'd really appreciate it if you could take 2 minutes to complete a feedback survey, which will be sent to you directly following the webinar. And obviously, it's designed to ensure that we ensure that our future webinars remain valuable and relevant to you, and give you an opportunity to let us know what you would like to hear from us about. So thank you again. I'm going to give back almost 1 minute of your day, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you. Goodbye.